Video title Outlaws threaten K9 handler's family, unaware her military dogs track them down. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful evening in the suburbs. A family gathered around the dinner table, laughter echoing through the halls of their home, unaware that a dark and dangerous storm was brewing just beyond their doorstep. The kind of storm that doesn't come with rain or wind, but with threats, terror, and a shadowy presence waiting to strike. But this was no ordinary family, and this wasn't just another night. The family's strength wasn't just in their bonds, but in their hidden connection to something far greater, something few people could ever truly understand. At the heart of this family was a woman whose skills were honed through years of sacrifice, danger, and an unwavering commitment to service. A seasoned K9 handler, she had seen it all. From overseas operations to grueling training exercises, she and her military dogs had faced the worst the world could throw at them. Yet she never imagined that the greatest threat to her family would come from a group of ruthless criminals who had no idea what they were about to provoke. It began like any typical night, but soon the phone rang. The voice on the other end was cold, threatening, filled with the kind of malice that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The Outlaws, a gang known for their violent and unpredictable nature, were out for revenge. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know her background, the fierce loyalty of her K9 partners, or the level of training her dogs had undergone. The threats against her family were swift and chilling, filled with promises of harm and destruction. They didn't know her well enough to realize that this wasn't just another warning. This wasn't the kind of woman to back down. This wasn't the kind of woman who would let her family be caught in the crossfire of someone else's vendetta. And she wasn't alone. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the very dogs they were about to unknowingly provoke had been trained to track down threats, to find what others couldn't see, to fight when it seemed like there was no chance left. The dogs weren't just pets. They were partners, warriors in their own right. And they had a job to do. As the threats escalated, she felt the weight of her training and her loyalty pull her into action. She knew her family was in danger, but she also knew that when you have the right tools, the right allies, and the right mindset, you can turn the tables. The dogs, her military dogs, had already picked up the scent of danger. They were out there, in the dark, silent and determined, ready to protect what was hers. The Outlaws thought they were the ones holding the power, thinking they could control the situation. But as the night wore on, and as the sound of barking dogs echoed through the trees, they began to realize they had made a terrible mistake. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated her dogs. Her military dogs, trained for the most extreme conditions, didn't care about the threats or the danger. They cared only about the mission. And the mission was clear: protect the family at all costs. But as the clock ticked down, the Outlaws grew more desperate. They weren't going to back down easily. With every passing minute, the tension rose. The dogs were closing in, but so were the criminals. They knew they were being hunted, and they weren't going to give up without a fight. And as the two forces, one human, one canine, prepared for their inevitable clash, it was clear that the outcome of this night would come down to more than just training or tactics. It would come down to survival. And just as the K9 team closed in on the hideout, something unexpected happened. A sudden move from the criminals that could change everything. Where was the danger truly lying? What was the trap they had set? And who was really hunting whom? The dogs were only one part of the equation, and the night was far from over. Would they catch the Outlaws before it was too late? Or was the family in more danger than they could have ever imagined? The night air felt colder now, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the K9 handler, the tension was almost unbearable. Her military training had taught her to anticipate every move, every possible outcome. But this situation was different. This wasn't some foreign mission where the rules of engagement were clear. This was personal. Her family was at stake, and no matter how many times she walked into dangerous situations, nothing could have prepared her for this. Her heart raced as she moved swiftly through the darkened woods behind her home. She could hear the steady panting of her dogs, their paws hitting the ground with practiced precision. Each step they took seemed to echo in the silence, louder than any of the surrounding sounds. These dogs weren't just her partners in crime fighting. They were part of her family. She trusted them more than most people. And right now, she needed their instincts more than ever. She had learned early on that the world wasn't always what it seemed. It wasn't just about the visible threats. It was about the things lurking just out of sight, the dangers that could only be detected by the sharpest senses. Her dogs had those senses, and it was why she dedicated her life to training them, pushing them to the limit. Their bond was more than just handler and animal. It was a partnership built on years of mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Her mind raced back to the phone call earlier that evening. She could still hear the voice on the other end of the line, low and threatening, each word filled with venom. The Outlaws had been after her for weeks, but now they were crossing a line they wouldn't be able to come back from. She wasn't just some target. They had crossed a boundary, threatening the very people she loved. They were making a mistake, and it was a mistake they would pay for. The Outlaws, a ruthless gang known for their violent behavior, were no strangers to the world of crime. They had made a name for themselves in the underworld, and their reputation for brutality was well established. They didn't care about rules, morals, or boundaries. They only cared about power. But what they didn't realize was that their latest target was far more than they'd bargained for. Her name wasn't known to them, but the dogs, they had a reputation all their own. And right now, the dogs were closing in. But even as her military training and her dog's instincts brought her closer to the Outlaws, something didn't sit right. The tension in the air felt thicker, more oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about threats. It was about something bigger, something the Outlaws had planned that she couldn't quite see. And as her dogs moved in, methodically searching every inch of the area, she knew they were getting closer to something. But what? In the distance, the faintest sound reached her ears. A rustling, a branch snapping, followed by muffled voices. The Outlaws were close. They knew they were being hunted, and from the sounds of it, they weren't running away. They were digging in, preparing for a confrontation. The handler felt a surge of adrenaline. It was now or never. She signaled her dogs to stay quiet, their sharp ears picking up the sounds around them, every rustle in the underbrush a possible clue. Her eyes scanned the terrain ahead, searching for any sign of movement. Every step felt like it could be her last. But this was the moment she had been trained for. Every night, she'd worked side by side with her dogs to prepare for this kind of threat. Every hour spent in the harshest environments had led to this point. She wasn't going to let them down. As they drew closer to the hideout, her mind flashed back to the early days of her career. She had always known that she was meant to work with dogs. There was a special connection between them, something unspoken but understood. They had saved her life more times than she could count, and in return, she had worked tirelessly to hone their skills. Together, they were unstoppable. But this was different. This wasn't a mission. This was personal. The Outlaws had underestimated her. They thought they were threatening her family, but in reality, they were threatening something far more dangerous. A trained K-9 handler and her military dogs who knew no fear. The deeper they moved into the woods, the stronger the scent of danger became. Her dogs' movements grew sharper, more calculated. They were zeroing in on something, and the handler's heart pounded in her chest as the moment of truth drew closer. But even as the dogs neared the hideout, the handler couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no sign of an ambush, no sudden movement from the outlaws. It was almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that made her skin crawl. And then, as if on cue, the trees shifted. Something, or someone, was moving toward them. The handler's instincts kicked into high gear. She raised a hand, signaling her dogs to stop. She held her breath, waiting. Every second felt like an eternity. Her eyes darted around, scanning the area, but all she could see was darkness. Her heart raced as the shadows seemed to shift. She wasn't alone anymore. The outlaws had been prepared for a confrontation, but they hadn't expected this. They had thought they were the ones who controlled the game. But now, the tables were turning. Her mind raced as she considered her options. Should she push forward? Should she wait for the dogs to make the first move? Her hand tightened on the weapon at her side. But it wasn't just the weapon she had to rely on. It was the dogs, their senses, their training, their drive. And they weren't going to let her down. A sound from behind snapped her attention back. A branch cracked, and her pulse quickened. The outlaws weren't the only ones who had a plan. It was clear now that they were trying to flank her. The handler turned quickly, raising her weapon as her dogs tensed, their bodies coiled with energy. The tension in the air was unbearable, each moment pregnant with the possibility of danger. Where were the outlaws now? What had they done to prepare for this? The night was far from over, and the handler knew this was only the beginning of the battle that was about to unfold. Would they manage to overpower the outlaws before it was too late? Or would the night end in chaos and tragedy, with no one left standing to tell the tale? The silence seemed to stretch on forever. The handler's breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale a measured step as she fought to keep her composure. Her dogs were perfectly still, their senses heightened, their muscles taut with anticipation. They were trained to act on instinct, to follow their handler's lead, and right now, that instinct was screaming that the outlaws were not the only threat. From the corner of her eye, she caught the faintest flicker of movement. Just a shadow, barely perceptible, but enough to send a chill racing down her spine. But dogs had already spotted it. Their ears perked up, their bodies stiffening, but they didn't bark. They were trained to remain silent, to give no warning until the exact moment they struck. But it wasn't the movement that had her heart pounding in her chest. It was the realization that the outlaws had anticipated her every move. They weren't hiding in a cave or behind a few trees, waiting for a direct confrontation. No, they had spread out, taken positions she hadn't accounted for. And just as she pieced it together, the first gunshot rang out. The blast echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sounds of chaos, footsteps scrambling, branches snapping, a deep growl from one of her dogs. Her reflexes kicked in before she could think. She dropped to the ground, signaling her dogs to stay low and move quickly. She knew what they were trying to do. The outlaws were trying to scatter them, draw them out into the open where they could control the field. But they underestimated her. They underestimated the dogs. "Tracker," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the crackling tension of the woods. One of her dogs, a large Belgian Malinois with a coat a color of rich mahogany, responded immediately. Tracker was a quiet force, always focused, always alert. He darted forward, a blur of motion in the dark, tracking the sounds of the criminals through the brush. In the distance, there was another sound. A faint crack of metal, like a door creaking open. It didn't take long for her to realize what that noise was. The outlaws had set up a trap. They'd lured her into the woods, hoping she would chase them into a position where they could ambush her. But they didn't know the first thing about her. She motioned for her dogs to follow, but the air was thick with something more than just the stench of danger. It was the scent of fear, something that hadn't existed in her world for years. These weren't just outlaws trying to make a profit. No, they had a vendetta. This was personal, and somehow, it had something to do with her past. As she pushed deeper into the woods, memories flooded back, fragments of old missions, faces she'd long since forgotten, and the dangerous choices she'd made as part of a world most people would never even understand. There were people from that world she had left behind, people who didn't forgive easily. She had done what was necessary to protect her own, but this felt different. Her thoughts were cut short when she heard another bark, sharp and urgent. It was Tracker, already several yards ahead of her, his body low to the ground as he tracked the scent. He had found something. The handler's heart raced as she quickly caught up with him. But as she neared, her instincts flared again. There was something about the scene, something that wasn't right. Tracker had stopped in front of an abandoned shed, its door slightly ajar. The wind rustled the trees around them, but there was no sign of movement from inside. Her mind was already running through scenarios. Had the outlaws laid a trap here? Or was this where they had been hiding? She motioned for the rest of her dogs to circle around, to cover all possible exits. The last thing she wanted was for them to be surrounded. But as she moved closer, the door creaked open further, revealing something she wasn't prepared for. Inside the shed, illuminated by the faint light of the moon, was a collection of equipment, a mix of military-grade gear, surveillance equipment, and documents scattered across a makeshift table. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, processing the items faster than her heart could keep up with. This wasn't just a hideout. This was a base of operations. The outlaws weren't just after her family. They were planning something much bigger. The handler's stomach twisted as she realized the full scope of their plot. These weren't just criminals. They were orchestrating something far more dangerous, something that involved her in ways she couldn't yet understand. Her hand clenched around her weapon, but she knew she couldn't make a move without more information. The dogs were trained to assess, not attack, unless absolutely necessary. But the tension was unbearable. Every minute that passed brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to an unknown danger. Just as she took another step forward, there was a sudden sound from behind her. A voice, low and gravelly, whispered from the darkness. "You should have stayed out of this." The handler froze, her blood running cold. She knew that voice. She didn't need to turn around to know that the person who spoke was someone from her past. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, emerged from the shadows, his face hidden by the low brim of his hat. He was one of them, the very same gang of criminals she had crossed paths with years ago. And now, he was standing in front of her, blocking her path. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The handler's dogs growled, their teeth bared as they flanked her, but they stayed back, waiting for the order to attack. Tracker stood firm beside her, his eyes locked on the man in front of them. "I didn't think you'd come back," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. "You're always the one who gets away, huh? You always think you can just disappear. But we find you. We always find you." She felt a chill race down her spine, the weight of the past crashing down on her like a wave. This wasn't just a fight for her family anymore. This was a reckoning. And the worst part, she still didn't know how deep the roots of this revenge went or how many more people were involved in this twisted plot. Her finger tightened around the trigger of her weapon, but something told her to wait. There was more to this. There had to be. She wasn't sure if the dogs would help her through this, or if they would be caught in a trap of their own. Every second felt like a countdown to something far more dangerous. The game had changed. The question now was, who was hunting whom? The silence between them stretched longer than it should have, each heartbeat loud in her ears. She could feel the weight of the man's eyes on her, his presence a dark shadow over the woods, and it was almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. His words still hung in the air, a reminder of the past she thought she had left behind. He hadn't just come for her family. He had come for her. This was personal, deeper than she could have imagined. Her dogs were on edge, every muscle coiled and ready to spring into action. Tracker, still at her side, let out a low growl, but he didn't move, waiting for her signal. The handler's mind was racing, processing everything too quickly. There were too many unknowns. How had they tracked her down? Why had they come back? What was the point of all this? The man's grin stretched wider beneath the brim of his hat, as though he could read her thoughts. You really think you can outrun us? You're a ghost in this world, but we never forget. Not you, not what you did to us. She took a step back, her eyes darting around, looking for any advantage. The dogs were ready, but they needed to know their target. Every instinct told her to wait, to hold her ground, but the longer she hesitated, the tighter the noose around her family's neck would become. The man knew this, and his smile deepened. He wasn't just taunting her, he was toying with her. We know all about your little operation, you know, he continued, his voice low but full of malice. You think these dogs are going to save you? They're nothing but weapons, just like you. And in the end, all weapons can be turned against you. Her blood ran cold, but her grip on the weapon tightened. He was right about one thing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything she had worked for, the life she had tried to protect. The silence in the woods felt oppressive now, the air thick with tension, every movement a potential threat. She could feel the dog's eyes on her, waiting for a command, and she knew she had to act. But then another sound cut through the stillness. A distant rustling, a faint crunching of leaves. The handler's head snapped to the side, eyes scanning the darkness. She wasn't alone. There was someone else out there, and they were closing in fast. Her heart raced again, this time for an entirely different reason. The outlaws weren't just making a stand. They had backup. This was a trap, a setup she hadn't accounted for. Get ready, the man warned with a sickening calmness, sensing her realization. We've been watching you for a long time. You and your dogs. It's over now. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced as the first shadows broke through the trees, figures emerging from the darkness, armed and silent. Her grip on her weapon was ironclad now, her every sense on high alert. She needed to think fast, needed to decide which way to move. There was no time to second-guess. The outlaws had the advantage, and yet for some reason, the handler felt a glimmer of hope flicker within her. The dogs were alert, their bodies tense, and she could feel their loyalty as strongly as her own heartbeat. Tracker was closest, his sharp eyes locked onto the man in front of them. The handler's mind was racing, calculating every possible angle. If she made a move now, the dogs would act, but would they be enough to take down all of them? She was trained for this, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. There were too many unknowns, too many risks. Another crack of a branch, closer now. Her attention snapped to the right. A second group of outlaws sneaking in from behind. The handler's pulse quickened, and for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of the situation. How thin the line between survival and failure had become. She raised her weapon, steadying her breathing, and signaled for the dogs to move. Tracker lunged forward, his jaws snapping, his powerful body a blur in the darkness. The other dogs followed suit, darting out into the woods with a fluidity that only years of training could create. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of barking, snarling, and the clash of bodies as they engaged the first wave of attackers. But just as the handler was about to follow, a blinding flash of light pierced the woods, illuminating the dark forest like a storm had struck. She stumbled back, her eyes squinting against the brightness, and for a moment she lost track of everything. The outlaws had set up floodlights. They knew exactly where she was. They weren't just hiding, they were prepared for a full assault. Her mind raced again. This was the moment. The showdown was inevitable. But the longer she hesitated, the more she could feel the tension building inside her. The dogs were fighting, but they were only one part of the equation. They couldn't keep up the pressure forever. She had to make her move now, or it would all be over. Her eyes locked onto the man who had first taunted her. He was still standing, watching, smiling in that sickening way he had. He wasn't afraid of her or her dogs. He was enjoying the chaos. "You should have stayed gone," he spat, taking a step closer, his voice hard and filled with venom. But the handler didn't respond. She wasn't going to let him control the situation. She took a deep breath, her fingers steady on the trigger. The dogs were closing in on the outlaws, but she couldn't waste time wondering if they were winning. It was now or never. Without another thought, she moved swiftly, stepping into the clearing where the lights shone bright. The dogs were already in the thick of it, their barks ringing out in the night. Tracker, as always, led the charge, his movements fluid, instinctive, a force of nature. But her focus wasn't on the battle ahead. It was on the man, on the mastermind behind all of this. He was standing between her and her family's safety. With her weapon aimed directly at him, she steadied herself for the final confrontation. Her heart was pounding, her breath shallow, but she was done waiting. It was time to finish this. But then, just as her finger began to pull the trigger, a deafening roar filled the air. The ground beneath her feet shook, and the world seemed to stop for a fraction of a second. What was that? What had just happened? The handler's eyes widened in disbelief. The outlaws hadn't just set up a trap for her. They had something far more dangerous at their disposal. And the fight she had been preparing for had just escalated beyond anything she could have imagined. The roar echoed through the trees, rattling the very air around her. For a split second, everything seemed to blur together. The dogs, the outlaws, the weapon in her hand. All of it felt distant, as if time itself had taken a breath and held it. She looked around, heart hammering in her chest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It wasn't just a roar. It was a warning. The ground beneath her feet vibrated again, more forcefully this time. Her dogs reacted immediately, their bodies tense, their eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. The handler's instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, that this was not part of the plan. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was becoming something far more deadly. The air was thick with tension as she squinted into the darkness. The outlaws had grown silent, their smug smiles wiped from their faces, their eyes wide with panic. They were no longer the confident, calculating figures she had faced just moments ago. Now they looked just as uncertain as she felt. They weren't in control anymore. Then the sound came again, a monstrous screech that seemed to tear through the forest. But this time it wasn't just a sound. It was accompanied by movement. From the shadows beyond the clearing, something enormous emerged, a dark silhouette that seemed to shift with the rhythm of the trees. The handler's blood ran cold as she realized what it was. A vehicle. But not any ordinary vehicle. This was an armored truck, its headlights blinding, its sides covered in thick, reinforced steel. It rumbled forward like a beast awakening from slumber, crushing anything in its path. She stumbled back, her mind trying to process the horror unfolding before her. The outlaws had planned for something bigger than she could have ever anticipated. They had brought in reinforcements, but not just human ones. This was military-grade equipment, an industrial-strength assault truck, and it was coming straight for them. Her dogs, sensing the danger, began to pull away from the area, but Tracker, ever loyal, remained at her side. The handler's thoughts raced. The odds had just shifted dramatically. What she had initially thought was a group of ruthless criminals had now become something far more complex. Whoever these people were, They had connections that reached far beyond anything she had imagined. The truck slowed as it neared the clearing, its massive tires grinding over the forest floor, and a voice boomed from within, distorted by a loudspeaker. "Get down, all of you! You've overstayed your welcome." Her body froze, a wave of dread washing over her. She hadn't just been dealing with petty criminals. This was something far more serious. The military-grade equipment, the strategically placed traps. It wasn't just revenge. It was a full-blown operation, and she was right in the middle of it. The dogs began to growl, their instincts warning them of the impending danger. But the handler knew that if they didn't act fast, there would be no fighting their way out of this. The outlaws were regrouping, and the truck had created a near-impenetrable barrier between her and any possible escape route. But then, just when she thought it couldn't get worse, the sound of engines revving cut through the air. More vehicles. More reinforcements. The handler's chest tightened as she realized the extent of the operation. The outlaws weren't just a group of individuals acting on their own. They were part of something larger, something far more organized and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The truck's headlights suddenly shifted, illuminating the handler and her dogs. For a brief moment, she stood exposed in the harsh light, and she could see the fear in the outlaws' eyes. They were terrified of what was coming, just as she was. But the handler couldn't allow herself to be distracted. The real threat was still ahead. "Move!" she barked to her dogs, her voice sharp with authority. Tracker reacted immediately, darting forward with the precision of a trained warrior. But she was already calculating her next move. She had to get ahead of this, had to regain control before they were completely overwhelmed. The ground rumbled again as the truck surged forward, its engine roaring to life. She knew this was no longer a battle of wits or skill. This was survival. She had no choice but to fight back, and she wasn't going to allow her family, her dogs, to become victims of this madness. The roar of the truck's engine grew louder as it approached, and the handler's thoughts snapped back to reality. She needed a plan. She needed an advantage. Her gaze swept across the clearing, but all she saw were trees, the massive truck, and the threatening figures emerging from the shadows. Then, she noticed something. A figure standing off to the side, partially hidden behind the armored truck. The same man who had spoken to her earlier, the one who had taunted her. He was looking directly at her now, a wicked smile creeping across his face. And that's when the realization hit her. This wasn't just about revenge. This wasn't about money or power or anything she had assumed. No, they had orchestrated this entire situation. They knew she would come. They knew her every move. They knew how to push her buttons, how to bring her to the breaking point. The figure stepped forward, his hand raised in a mock salute. "I thought you'd be more prepared for a fight," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But this is where it all ends. You're outmatched." She clenched her jaw, her mind whirring. There was something else, something more sinister lurking beneath his words. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a setup, a trap that had been laid from the beginning. And the real question now wasn't whether or not they'd win this fight. It was what their true goal was. The truck revved its engine once again, the tires churning as it began to inch forward, and that's when the handler understood. This wasn't just about bringing her down. It was about something much darker, much more dangerous. With no other options left, she made her move. "Tracker, stay with me," she whispered, already turning to face the looming threat. But just as she braced herself for the worst, she heard a distant sound. A siren, faint but growing louder. It was coming from beyond the forest, from the direction she had just left. Was it backup? Or was it something even worse? The siren grew louder, its wailing cutting through the tension in the air like a blade. For a moment, everything stopped. The outlaws, the armored truck, even the handler herself, paused, as if frozen in time, unsure of what was coming. The rumble of the truck's engine filled the silence once again, but this time there was a new edge to the sound. The distant siren was close now, not just an echo, but a presence. Something was coming, something that would tip the scales. The man who had taunted her, the leader of the Outlaws, narrowed his eyes and took a step back, his confidence faltering for the first time. "What is that?" he muttered almost to himself. The handler didn't waste a second. She had no time to consider what this new development meant. If there was any chance of escaping this alive, it was now. "Tracker," she barked, her voice harsh and commanding. The dog responded instantly, charging forward, ready to take on whatever threat lay ahead. Her other dogs followed suit, instincts firing as they braced for the chaos that was about to unfold. In the split second it took for the dogs to surge forward, the truck's headlights flashed, momentarily blinding her. The Outlaws scattered, their previous arrogance gone in an instant. She could see it now, the fear in their eyes, the realization that whatever backup was arriving wasn't friendly. The siren continued to wail, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. A black SUV emerged from the trees, barreling down the narrow path with a force that made the ground tremble. Its sleek form was almost entirely black, with tinted windows and a grille that looked like it could plow through anything in its way. But what caught her eye wasn't the vehicle itself. It was the figures inside, armed and ready, their faces hidden behind masks, as if they were part of an even darker force than the Outlaws. Before the handler could process what was happening, the SUV skidded to a halt just a few feet away. The doors flung open, and several men in full tactical gear spilled out. Their movements were precise, coordinated like soldiers, not criminals. For a heartbeat, there was complete silence. The handler's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the scene. These weren't the cops, she realized. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to ensure that something or someone stayed right where they were. The leader of the Outlaws, who had been so sure of his victory, now stood frozen, his face paling. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky, no longer the confident sneer it had been earlier. The man in the front of the tactical group stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. "We're the ones who make sure people like you don't get to walk free. You've been marked. This operation was never meant for you to win." He turned his gaze to the handler, his eyes cold, unreadable. "You did exactly what we wanted. You played your part." The handler's blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? Had she been manipulated this entire time? She had always believed she was the one calling the shots. But now, she wasn't so sure. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a much deeper game, one she had only been a pawn in. Suddenly, the sound of her dogs barking fiercely snapped her back to the present. Tracker, with his powerful jaws, had already subdued one of the Outlaws, and the other dogs were handling the rest of the attackers with relentless precision. But even as the Outlaws were being overwhelmed, she couldn't shake the growing dread that this was far from over. The man in tactical gear, the one who had spoken, slowly turned back to her, his face still hidden behind a mask. "Your role in this is complete," he said, as though the entire battle had been nothing but a scripted performance, one she had unknowingly played her part in. "We'll handle the rest." For a second, everything clicked into place: the Outlaws, the trap, the dogs. The handler had been part of a much larger operation than she could have fathomed. This wasn't just a revenge mission against her family. It was an orchestrated play, and she had been a key player in it all along. But just as she tried to make sense of the chaos, something else happened. One of the Outlaws, the one who had first confronted her, managed to break free from the dog's grasp. His movements were erratic, driven by panic, but in his desperation, he grabbed something from his belt, something small but lethal. A detonator. The handler's eyes widened in horror as the man's fingers hovered over the button. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was trying to take everything down with him. The tactical team, the entire area. In that split second, everything hung in the balance. Tracker, still at his side, let out a sharp bark, almost as if sensing the danger. Without thinking, the handler dove forward, knocking the outlaw to the ground just as his finger pressed the button. Time seemed to freeze. There was a deafening silence before the ground shook with the force of an explosion. The force sent her flying back, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she couldn't tell if she was alive or if everything had ended in that instant. Then the smoke began to clear, and she realized the blast had been contained, perhaps due to the quick thinking of the tactical team or some other unforeseen factor. But the danger was far from over. She could still hear the sounds of chaos. Dogs barking, people shouting, and the distant thud of footsteps retreating. As the dust settled, she looked up, her body aching, her mind still spinning from the shock. The tactical team had regained control, the outlaws subdued, but her thoughts were clouded with more questions than answers. What had just happened? Who were these people? And what had she just been a part of? The leader of the tactical group stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers once again. You did well, but we still have work to do. This was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. And that was when the final twist hit her like a punch to the gut. The battle wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. The handler stood, shaking off the disorientation, her mind clear now. She had come to realize one undeniable truth. Everything she had fought for, everything she had risked, none of it had been under her control. She had been playing into someone else's hands the entire time. With her dogs at her side, and the tactical team watching her closely, she knew one thing for certain. The next chapter of this twisted game was about to unfold. And this time, she wasn't going to let herself be a pawn any longer. The dust from the explosion began to settle, and the once chaotic clearing slowly returned to an eerie calm. The handler's breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse still racing from the adrenaline. But she knew the worst wasn't over. The dogs, still alert, scanned the area for any signs of remaining danger. But the tactical team had already moved in, securing the perimeter and subduing the last of the outlaws. The leader of the tactical group, the man who had orchestrated this whole thing, approached her with a steady, unflinching gaze. "You're lucky," he said, his tone flat and almost emotionless. "Not everyone makes it through something like this." She could barely process his words, her mind still trying to comprehend the web of lies and manipulation that had led her here. She had been used, a pawn in a game she had never even realized she was playing. The outlaws, the military-grade trucks, the carefully set traps, it had all been staged from the start, and she had unknowingly walked right into it. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of it all. "I was just trying to protect my family." The man's expression softened for just a moment, as if considering her words. "We know. But sometimes you don't get a choice. Sometimes the mission chooses you." Her mind flashed back to the faces of the outlaws, people who had been so sure they were in control, only to be undone by something far bigger than them. It made her wonder how many more operations like this were out there, hidden behind masks of legality or power. How many other unsuspecting people had been swept up into these larger games without ever realizing it. As the tactical team finished securing the area, one of the officers came over, handing her a small package. "This is for you," he said simply. The handler took it, her curiosity piqued. Inside the package was a flash drive, its label unreadable, as well as a small note. She glanced at the note, her heart sinking as she read the single line. "Asterisk, the mission is far from over asterisk." The weight of those words hit her like a punch to the gut. No matter how much she had fought, no matter how many lives had been lost or altered, there were still deeper, darker layers to this operation that had yet to be revealed. The games weren't over, but she couldn't allow herself to feel overwhelmed. Not yet. The tactical team leader, noticing her reaction, stepped forward again. "You're in this now," he said, "whether you want to be or not." His words didn't feel like a threat, but more like a grim reality. The handler had always prided herself on being in control, on knowing how to handle every situation, every crisis. But this was different. This was a fight against something much larger than any one person. And yet, despite the weight of it all, she couldn't back down. She looked around at her dogs, still by her side, as if they too were waiting for her next move. Tracker, the ever-loyal leader of the pack, stood closest, his eyes watching her closely. In that moment, the handler realized something important. She had the tools to fight back. She had the skills, the training, and the heart to stand her ground. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about making sure that no one else would be caught in the crossfire of someone else's war. With a deep breath, she stood tall, taking a step toward the tactical leader. "I'm not walking away from this," she said firmly. "I'll see this through. But you need to tell me what's really going on. Who's behind all of this?" The man didn't hesitate. "We'll bring you in, but you have to understand, the stakes are much higher than you think. This isn't just about your family, or these outlaws. This is global. Powerful people are behind all of this, and they won't stop until they've achieved their goal." The handler nodded, her resolve hardening. She had a purpose now. The weight of the flash drive in her hand was a constant reminder of that. This wasn't just about one fight anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. She turned her attention to the horizon, her mind already racing with possibilities. There would be answers. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter how long it took or how dangerous the road ahead might be. As the tactical team packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, one of the officers gave her a nod of respect. "You've got guts," he said, his tone genuine. "Most people would have backed down." "I'm not most people," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos still swirling around her. "And I'm not backing down." She watched as the team left the area, the distant sound of their vehicles growing fainter with each passing second. As the last truck disappeared into the trees, the handler turned her focus to the flash drive once more. There was more to this story, and she would find it. It wasn't over. And so, with a determined heart and her loyal dogs at her side, she set out into the unknown, ready to take on whatever came next. The mission, as cryptic as it was now hers to finish. She didn't know who the enemies were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. They had underestimated her, and that was going to cost them. The handler's journey was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. With every step she took, she was getting closer to the truth, and closer to a confrontation that could change everything. But for now, she would take it one step at a time, because she knew that sometimes the best way to win was simply to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. And as she walked deeper into the night, she couldn't help but feel that the real fight, the one that would define everything, was still to come.